Yo, what is up, my friends? Welcome to another episode of Dostcast. My name is Vinamre. If you are new to our YouTube channel, please subscribe because we release new episodes every Tuesday and Friday at 12 p.m. Indian Standard Time. If you're listening to this podcast on an audio platform, make sure you give us 5 stars because we're the best. Today's guest is Sriram Balasubramanian, an author and an economist at one of the world's leading monetary institutions. His areas of interest include global macroeconomics and socio-economic trends, emerging markets, and Indic/Dharmic culture. His new book, Kautliyanomics for Modern Times, is now out. We discussed a fair bunch about the book. This is an episode where we dove deep into something that many people do not cover, which is Chanakya, aka Kautilya's economic policies, and can we apply them to the modern world? Can you and I be a Dharmic capitalist? This and several other answers from the man who has been published in several international publications such as Bloomberg, Foreign Policy, The Wall Street Journal, Vox EU, among many others. You will really enjoy this episode if you are someone who's interested in Indic culture, Dharmic culture, and how you can apply the teachings of Chanakya in your life. The episode with Sriram Balasubramanian begins in 3, 2, 1. I'm on a WhatsApp group run by Ami Ganatra, who's the author of Mahabharata Unraveled and Ramayana Unraveled right now. The group is dedicated to Kautilya's Arthshastra only. So I've done a few sessions here and there, which would also be an interesting angle. Anyway, to start things off, I think the most rudimentary question that will set groundwork for this discussion is, who is Chanakya? And number two, you used a fairly less commonly used name for him, which is Kautilya, right? And I'm just wondering, is that from a strictly SEO standpoint because people are bored of hearing the word Chanakya? Or you figured that maybe those two are different?
Yeah, thank you, Vinamre. It's great to be on your show. I'm quite new to your show, but some recent episodes which I've heard are very interesting. So glad to be here.
Thank you.
And these are my personal views since it's my book. So just for the record, and thank you. I think that's a very interesting question because, the name of Chanakya in popular domain is Chanakya. But there's also, the reason why I sort of went for Kautilya is that, there wasn't sort of a deliberate reason. It's just that when I started reading about the Arthshastra, my familiarity was more towards Kautilya. So in the sense, I sort of read, through that name more. And I just, on hindsight, I think it's also because since this name is less familiar, I thought it might have a greater appeal.
Yeah.
Purely for the book, people might ask the same question as what you're asking. So I didn't really think about that, while I was writing the book. But I think at some point, I just felt this sounded better for this book. I don't really have a particular reason.
Yeah, it's a cool little name for sure, because I think people are kind of saturated with the name Chanakya. It's been a bedrock of best-selling books in bookstores in India for almost a decade now, right?
That's right. Yeah, and on Chanakya or Kautilya, I think most people understand who he was and what he did. To put it very simply, he was one of the most pioneering strategic thinkers of the Mauryan dynasty. He sort of conceptualized and helped Chandragupta Maurya take over the throne. And then the dominance of the Mauryan sort of empire is attributed to some of his, main ideas, some of his strategic sort of Chanakya nitis, and his sort of vision for the Mauryan empire. But I think the Arthashastra as a text ends right there. Because the text by itself, in my view, is context agnostic. In the sense, you wouldn't sort of find specific mentions of kings or kingdoms or, specific sort of ideological beliefs in the text, across the books of the Arthashastra. So there is an undercurrent of Dharma, obviously, which I detail in the book, but the nature of the text is in a way, it's written in a way which can be applied for any context, or put it this way, can't be applied for a particular context. Chanakya, I think Kautilya sort of wanted this text to be a template at any point of time, right? So that's how the text is written, right? While a lot of Chanakya Niti, which people take from the text and sort of, give quotes, quotations, or whatever it is, those are all based on a text which is sort of context agnostic. I think that's important to understand, because the idea of other sort of books, the famous comparison of Machiavelli, which often people do.
Yeah, I have it right here. I was going to bring that up. That's one of my favorite books. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the, those type of books are written for a particular king, or protecting a particular sort of monarch. And sort of, but I think Kautilya's perspective is the welfare of the people is primary for his sort of worldview.
Right.
The king is used sort of a tool to enable that process. There's a quote which I give in the beginning of the book. Prajanam tu sukhe rajyaha. And that quote basically sums up, in my view, of how Kautilya viewed statecraft, economic policy, defense, and everything else. He saw the monarch as sort of a tool to enable the welfare of the people.
Right.
And prosperity as a foundation to his sort of political dominance. Right?
This is in contrast to Machiavelli, who simply wrote he was a failed politician who wanted to write for the Medicis, wanted to write a book for them, like a treatise for the Medicis, that they could, who were the rulers of erstwhile rulers of Italy at that time. Since he was a failed politician, that didn't really work for him. But as I've read The Prince several times, I understand that most of it is written for acquiring and seizing power, and delves into territories that many might consider dark or in the gray areas of morality. There are passages there's an entire chapter which says how to be cruel. That's an entire chapter, right? On the other hand, I do find that in common parlance, there's these quotes that I see on Instagram that pop up all the time about Chanakya. Never tell anyone your secrets, right? And it sort of borders on that whole, be guarded and be devious. As I mentioned, Ami Ganatra, in one of the WhatsApp group that she runs, one of the things she's taught is Chanakya actually asked Maurya, Chandragupta Maurya, to keep a network of spies, right? So that falls in the whole network of deception and surveillance. That, to me, upon reading your book, I was like, I get the welfare part, I get the Dharmic capitalism part, I get that his economics has its basis in Dharma, but there's still all these things that he's sort of preaching that fall directly in opposition to what the book says, or what his economics say.
Yeah, see, that is again, the sort of challenge in or the multidimensional nature of his personality, right? Because he was a political player, no doubt, right? The book doesn't, look at the political angle of how Kautilya was. It looks at primarily the economic angle of what he does. No doubt there are certain issues in his sort of political sort of thinking of, what you mentioned, how you deal with spies, his views on a variety of issues. Those are all things which are, contentious, no doubt. And I think you're right in the sense that because the Arthashastra as a text is so broad in its dimension. It covers so many sectors. It covers strategy, it covers defense, it covers economics, it covers politics, it covers, things like, national security, spies, and whatnot. So there are areas which are great. I don't argue, or even in this economic thinking, I sort of mentioned that, he doesn't provide the solution to all of our problems. No, there's no way that is the case. The argument that I sort of make in the book is to say that, first, to acknowledge that he probably had a sort of an understanding, which is far more just, refined than what he's given credit for in terms of his understanding of economic thinking. The second point is about the idea of prosperity being a foundation for his other aspects, which we speak about. And the third part is, what are some of the things that you could learn and adapt to today's times which are relevant?
Right.
There are lots of things which are not relevant. So, answering a question, he's definitely a complex character, right? There are definitely issues which are, very much contentious in today's times, especially on his politics, on some of the things that he did.
Right.
But for the reason why I sort of focused on economics is that was my focus in the book. So I sort of primarily focused on that zone.
Got it. Moving on about that, one of the things you mentioned in the book is there. Kautilya says that there are several life objectives in an individual's life, which is, I guess, standard Sanatani dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, right? And then he mentions material prosperity above all. I really like that. It's in sync with our times, where we find that if you have wealth, you can solve a lot of your problems. You can get salvation. Allegedly, you can, satisfy your desires, and you can do other stuff. It's also something that famous investor Naval Ravikant talks about a bunch. It's very much in sync with our times. And then also in the book later on, you mentioned that something along the lines of how the darshanas are made for people who have the ability to question things and do not accept things without questioning, whereas we are used to the feel-good stuff of the Vedas. The reason I bring all of these together is probably, it seems to me that in a lot of notable figures that we've sort of seen in our history, he seems to be someone who probably is the first notable figure to say that money above all, or material prosperity above all, and there is nothing wrong in doing that.
Yeah, in the sense that, look, there is again gradations in our own ancient texts, right? I mean, between the differentiation between smritis and shrutis is one sort of big bucket of differentiations, right? And then there are further differentiations on subject matter experts, put it that way, in modern parlance, right? You had, Aryabhatta, you had, various thinkers specializing in various areas of expertise, right? So what tends to happen is that we tend to juxtapose these two sets of scriptures in ancient texts, right? The Arthashastra, for example, is predominantly a materialistic text. It means a conventional sort of person, a day-to-day sort of living person, goes through, it's meant for that kind of a materialistic world. It doesn't dwell into afterlife. It doesn't dwell into spirituality. It doesn't dwell into rituals. It doesn't dwell into even, you don't find too many mentions of anything religious in the text. In fact, Kautilya even goes to say that, the idea of superstition is problematic for him. The idea of people consulting the stars is an issue for him. The idea of dynastic, dynastic succession, if if it is incompetent dynasts being at the helm is a problem for him, right?
Right.
So he is sort of a guy who is, so what I'm trying to say is that, like, how a mathematical text functions purely in its own zone, that's how the Arthashastra functions in its own zone, right?
Got it.
So the comparison with other texts, again, see, even the Ramayana Mahabharata, for example, I'm no expert on this, but from my sort of limited understanding, there is a spiritual angle to the text, right? And then there's a practical sort of operational angle to the text, right?
Right.
So, if, for example, there's a war which is happening, you need to have chariots in the war, you need to have, missiles in the war, whatever, some sort of equipment for the war. There's some level of sort of practical, day-to-day happenings, operational happenings that is happening around, right?
Right.
You could analyze that, for example, even though it's sort of the bigger picture is sort of a spiritual text.
Right.
You could analyze these aspects of it and still figure out or make an analysis or a book or do research or whatever it is, right? And then there are texts like specialized texts like the Arthashastra or the Ayurveda, for example, which dwell particular into one zone without any references to all this. So what I feel is that, one, the ability to question is very important, which is, I think, foundational to Sanatana Dharma. And second is to also acknowledge that even in ancient times, there were people who were specialized in certain areas. Not everyone was a jnani, not everyone was a sadhu. There's probably a guy like me and you figuring out, sitting under some tree, doing something else. I mean, creative drawing, perhaps, I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is that the ability to question in these type of, focused areas is much more. And I think Kautilya probably would felt the need to sort of mention that even more, because in his zone of statecraft and, and Artha, there's so much to question. So I think he was at a bit more liberty to sort of go gung-ho about it. But I agree that, the ability to question and the idea of Purusharthas, right? I mean,
sorry, what is the idea? What's the idea that you mentioned?
The Purusharthas, the four, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Right. If you look at the introductory chapter in the book, we sort of, Kautilya himself acknowledges a lot of his ideas were sort of picked up from earlier text and earlier sort of experiences. And he admits to that, right? He himself says that it's a compilation of various ideas, which is what the Arthashastra text eventually sort of morphed into. The idea, but I think credit to him goes that, you're right. He's one of the first few thinkers of his time to sort of get the idea of material prosperity as, centerfold,
right.
For other sort of developments.
One of the things you mentioned in the book, you actually use 3 different analogies for taxation. One of which, I guess, a summation of all of that is to have the largest possible tax with the least amount of annoyance to the population, right? And I thought it'd be a funny thought experiment to try and see how much of that applies to real life, where we all know that we understand the merits of taxes on some level. And I'm no expert on governments or taxes, right? I pay my taxes just like everyone else. But the fact that the Arthashastra is a book written for governance, and he's instructing the rulers to tax the biggest amount possible, right? To even attempt to advise something like that, one could argue is against the very welfare of the people that he professes to hold paramount. And I'm just wondering, there are other economic concepts that you mentioned later on in the book that I would just like to bring up, such as Just a sec. Well, for example, diminishing returns. There's a few others. Just a sec. Opportunity cost, demand supply framework, diminishing returns, liquidity, all of those things that are typically modern economic concepts that, I mean, you're an economist, you do this for a living. I've just read this in 11th grade once. But my point is, he's bringing up all of these things that you typically would assume are a consequence of modern thought, or a consequence of constant iteration in the so-called modern world and then the postmodern world that we live in. But it seems like in his time, he's arriving at these concepts with little to no help. Maybe there's not a word that he has for them, but would you call him the equivalent to like a modern economist / political strategist? Is he fitting that framework at all?
Yeah, look, I think there are two sections to your question, right?
Sure.
The first part is, what are the concepts? Or, there are some concepts which he has sort of used, and these concepts are far ahead of its time, right? So in contemporary economic discourse, most of these concepts are attributed to some Western thinkers. It could be Adam Smith, it could be mainly Adam Smith, but it could be Turgot, it could be Weiser, it could be Marshall, Bernoulli. So each of these guys, at some point in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, had sort of brought these concepts to the fore, which were further developed, and academia sort of took them along, right? The question really is, more than my book, I think Professor Sehag's book and also Professor Diodo's book sort of deals into this in a bit more academic depth, where we sort of show that, the Kautilya had an understanding of these concepts in a far more refined way that we give him credit for. And that's primarily the reason why, most of it is not sort of feeding, why it takes some effort to sort of extract this from the text, is the nature of the text itself, right? That is something I think your listeners need to understand. Most ancient texts are like this. And I think that Arthshastra is even more like that. In the sense, first of all, they're very dense Sanskritam. So they're very poetic in nature. And they have a sort of structure based on which you have to extract the text. So that's why there's a subsection called Tantra Yukti, which we deal with, which I deal with in the book, which is a sort of a technique which is used in the Ayurveda and the Arthshastra to sort of extract through a logical prism of thought process defined in those ancient times, to extract from the text what he's trying to do or what he's trying to say, right? So one is this entire prism of extraction. Another is the idea of subject matter expertise, right? Because of the fact that this covers a wide range of areas, you would need a strategic expert, for example, a foreign policy expert, to sit down and extract the foreign policy element of the text. And then you need probably an economist like this to extract that part of it. So, and then the third is to contextualize that in how we define it, right? So how we define opportunity cost, how we define minimum wage, how we define in today's times, right? So that is primarily the challenge. So this is a big picture context. So coming to your question again. So the idea of some of these concepts, he has used some of these concepts. So take the idea of minimum wage, right? We talk about $15 minimum wage in the US, which is a fairly common, discussion point, which your viewers might have listened to.
Yeah, it's a bedrock of several political promises as well, raising the minimum wage or
that's right.
Complaining about it, right?
That's right. You have debates in India today about, minimum wage in urban areas and rural areas or whatever it is, right? So Kautilya had this idea of a differentiated minimum wage, which is an interesting concept, where he says that people at various levels, the lowest levels up to a particular, say, income level, will have a particular minimum wage, right? And then he would, so for people with a higher income, they have a sort of another set of, minimum wages, which he proposes. So the idea of minimum wage, for example, is something that he practically implemented. You wouldn't find a direct translation of a minimum wage into Sanskritam in the text, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you read the text, if you extract it through a financial prism, you would understand that this is the sort of idea that he's proposing. The same thing with things like opportunity cost. Professor Sihag, in fact, mentions that, the entire sort of demand-supply framework, your linear income tax. I mean, you spoke about tax earlier, right? So his level of taxation was about approximately, about 1/6 of your income. And that's, coming to similar rates to what we have today. I mean, there might be some differences, in between countries. But his idea of, sort of tax principles were also similar. I mean, he, for example, proposed the idea that it's like taking, you have to be very careful with taxation. He understood that, it's like honey that you take from a bee, that there's a threshold level to it where people get really annoyed with you.
Yeah, you don't want to piss them off or they'll sting you.
That's right. So he was aware of such principles. And he had various levels of taxation for various levels of people with various levels of income levels during those times. He saw it as sort of a revenue aggregator for the state. And even the king had to, for example, the king was seen as sort of the taxpayers' Raja, not just a monarch. And then there was the idea of private sector. I mean, there was the idea of differentiation in taxes between imports and exports. So, for example, he promoted a lot of imports into the country or into the empire, the Mauryan Empire, for example, because he was a globalist by himself. He wanted to promote sort of global trade. So there was differentiation in those tax principles. How you're going to, for example, tax people? Do you tax them on profits? Do you tax them on income? Do you tax them in terms of what is their sort of net asset value, meaning what is their overall asset value? So he had these sort of differentiations of taxation and an understanding of the differentiation of taxation as well in his text. So the answer to your question is yes, there are lots of these concepts. Let me just quickly read you some of them.
Mm-hmm. Before you do, I just have a smaller question in just to insert that. What do you think makes him such a lucid thinker? Is he sitting under a tree in the Mauryan dynasty empire at that time and just thinking of these things? Is he borrowing it from some of the older Sanatan Dharma texts? Is he doing it, if we have accounts of that, is he doing it through constant interaction with the populace of that time and sort of building hypotheses for taxation, for land use, for debt, and for all of the concepts, before we get into the nitty-gritties of the concepts?
Yeah, I think that's my sense. To be honest, I don't, have the sort of ideological bandwidth to, to tell you whether there were any inscriptions or scriptures, on this particular question. But from my reading of the text these years, my understanding is it's sort of a manual of someone who's practically sort of dealt with these issues with the populace rather than a theoretical construct, right? If it is a theoretical construct, it would be like a textbook, which isn't the case. The reason why we're trying to extract a textbook out of it is because it's become very practical in its implementation. Right. I would say that the text is on the other side of, practicality. So I would put him as someone who's definitely a sort of a big picture thinker. who has the ability to sort of think across board,
Hmm.
but also someone who's very sensitive towards the practical limitations of some of these things. So I would say he would be a sort of a political economist of sorts who sort of has an understanding of the practical limitations. From my sort of interpretation of the text.
Got it.
So yeah, so just on the concepts, right? I mean, if you take, say, the idea of moral hazard, if you take the idea of, say, we spoke about things like opportunity cost. So opportunity cost in the sort of Western framework was started by Wieser in 1889. Demand supply frameworks were Marshall in 1870. Law of diminishing returns, Sturgard in 1766. The idea of linear income tax was more recent. Public goods and producer surplus, another concept, for example, was again Marshall in 1870. Capital formation, the idea of capital, was through Smith in 1776. All of these sort of concepts, Kautilya deals with them at some level or the other in the text, and he sort of showcases it as not at a theoretical level, but at a more practical level. So he sort of implements it and then allows you to back guess it in that sense. So in the bigger picture of things, I feel that a lot of these ideas Kautilya had, he had implemented some of these ideas. The level of refinement of these ideas might be not that refined. Over a period of time, the refinement might be better off or more refined in more recent times. But at the conceptual underpinnings, I think he had a much better, he was a pioneer in that sense of having a conceptual understanding, right? See, another thing is you have to, he's not like a Ramanuja, right? Ramanuja, for example, he lived very short period of time. He had a divine sort of, by his own sort of recollections, had sort of a divine Devi telling him, a lot of these mathematical formulas, which he sort of, replicates. Kautilya is not like that. He's like, probably a normal guy who's just extremely shrewd, extremely analytical, extremely practical, and also, had a very, very good understanding of finance and economics at that time. And he could sort of gauge why that would be the better of perspective. So in that sense, I feel he's a much more practical person, and a lot of ideas are, implemented on the ground.
Right.
That's why in a sense, I also feel that could be also the reason why he didn't really go too much on the theoretical construct of these things. Because, probably in those times, the need for practical sort of approaches was far more ahead than the sort of theoretical, or at least he felt the need for a more practical approach than let's say, a theoretical construct.
Yeah, he must really be someone who struck out like a sore thumb. I'm just wondering, if he didn't have political power, what would have happened with him? He would just, we're just assuming he would probably be a cynical man with a lot of brains. But thank God he knew how to climb politically. Which reminds me, so this text, Arthshastra, is written for Chandragupta Maurya to help him essentially run his empire, expand geopolitically, but do it through an economic lens, to do it through strengthen the empire through economics, right?
Wait,
this is written for
No. Okay. So let me correct you a bit there.
Sure.
At least my take on this, right? The text is context agnostic. While the popular notion is that it is a replication of what Chandragupta Maurya's empire was, right? I don't see too much evidence saying that Chandragupta Maurya replicated one-to-one everything that Chanakya or Kautilya said.
That's what I was going to ask. Like, how much was the advisor actually listened to?
Exactly. So the advisor decided to do a text like this because he didn't want the interventions of the practical difficulties of the state telling you what to do or what not to do, right? There's a reason why I think he has made this context agnostic. He just wants to say it what he thinks as it is. My view is that, there could be some areas, quite a few areas, which they have picked up, the Mauryans had picked up for their, progress. But there could be some areas which is just not practical according to the way they're running their kingdom for the Raja itself. So I wouldn't say it's a complete replica. There are lots of ideas which were used from here, but the text is not written for him. The text is written, if I'm sitting down here and say writing a text, independent of who the king is, independent of who the kingdom is, this is what I say for it. I'm living in a particular context, particular, time frame. But
it's like a white
independent
paper
of the monarch or the king, I'm going to write a text.
Right.
So I think that's how you sort of should view this.
Listen to this. When you first wake up in the morning, before you get dressed, wipe your bare testicles with a clean linen handkerchief. Fold the handkerchief neatly and wear it as a pocket square in your jacket all day. The book promised that women would find the smell irresistible. Whether or not it worked, the advice made pocket handkerchiefs hugely popular. This is one of the several insights in my brand new newsletter. Abhi filhal ke liye isko Vinamre's newsletter bolenge, that I sent out twice a month. It is now available. मैं जो भी बढ़िया से बढ़िया किताबें पढ़ रहा हूँ, all the books that I'm reading, my top insight from that. It's a very small newsletter. It'll get delivered to your inbox so that you can get peaked कि यार ये किताब कितनी फाड़ है, should I read it? And just like give you like the best curation of what I think is most interesting from these books. ठीक है? उसके लिए sign up करना है, सिर्फ अपना email address use करके, link description के अंदर है. This is going to be the best newsletter you've ever discovered. I genuinely believe it. Over 1,700 people have already signed up. Wait mat kariye. This is the top tier shit, top shelf OG maal hai ye wala. If you ever followed my previous channel, Shatir, you know what I'm talking about. This is that good shit. This is the shit that'll knock off your pants. It's high quality writing, curated especially for you guys. Link description mein hai. Sign up karna na bhule. Yeah. So what I was coming to from that is, so even if it's context agnostic, even if it's say written in his time, and we don't know for sure how much of it was actually implemented in the time that Kautilya and Chandragupta Maurya were alive. Can we extract lessons from that and implement it in today's times? Because, I mean, if we were to loosely say, we don't really have monarchs in the modern world. We have governments, right? We have heads of institutions who roughly either have citizens or stakeholders or employees, something like that. So if we were to take that approach, that administration approach that Kautilya proposes, and implement it on our world, what do you think would be some of the key challenges, some things that would just fit right in with his approach, and how much of what this text says is compatible with our times? Because your title is literally Kautliyanomics for the modern times, but especially for say you transition from kings to governments.
Yeah, so that's a very important question. So the idea of a nation state in the history of the world, for example, is a fairly new concept, right? So it's about, so if you take any ancient text, you always have this sort of, when you deal with statecraft, you always have this sort of challenge, right? As I mentioned earlier, I think the one-to-one sort of replica in terms of ideas, thoughts, principles is impossible, is, it's not useful, is counterproductive, right? What I think would be useful is forget the state, right? Forget how the state is constructed. It could be a nation state, it could be a monarch, forget that. If you look at ideas, right? So let's take the, Kautilya's view on labor contracts, for example, right? It's an idea, right? A labor contract is, say, a contract between an employer and an employee, right? You have, say, 5 people working for you. They have a contract, say, for a year, for 2 years, forever. depending on performance, right? That's a very practical thing which is happening even today, right? Kautilya's theory on labor contracts is that he felt that even the most low-level laborers, forgive me for the language, when I mean low-level, low-income laborers, who are working on, say, day-to-day wage laborers, right? He felt that even those day-to-day wage laborers required a contractual understanding with the employer, right? Which means I'm going to work, say, 10 hours a day. You're going to pay me, say, whatever, X number of rupees per hour for 10 hours a day, right? And I'm going to define, both of us are going to sit down and define what that quantum of work is going to be for how long, right? And then there is if you violate the terms for whatever it is, even though you're the employer, I have the right to say that, no, this is what we agreed on, right? So this is something which we struggle even in today's India, right? Low wage laborers, per hour laborers, wage laborers have very little rights and responsibilities because forget contracts. They don't even have a sort of an arrangement with the employer. Whereas Kautilya advocated for transparency of these contracts, not just having these contracts. He's saying make them public. So if you go to a construction facility, okay, he's saying that these sort of contracts need to be publicly sort of maintained so that anyone can come and look at these contracts and sort of assess it or ensure that there's compliance and things like that, right? So this is a simple idea on labor contracts, right? You don't need the state. It doesn't matter if it's a monarch. It doesn't matter if it's a democracy or a nation state. But this idea can be implemented at a granular level for greater efficiency, greater sort of empowering the real poor to sort of get their rights based on a tweak like this in the system, right? So this is a small example. This is how even the idea of minimum wage, for example, which we discussed earlier, that's another sort of an area where we could sort of learn things from and apply to some of our policies today.
Yeah.
So my broader sort of construct is we should look at these ideas that we're seeing. And I think that the entire Dharmic capitalism framework, which I propose for Kautilya, is based on that, sort of idea of using Dharma, the concepts of Dharma, as a sort of a self-correcting mechanism for both the state and the market.
Right.
I think that's how he viewed it. He viewed his sort of economic philosophy. So if we move from a sort of a big picture, big administration sort of a thinking and come to sort of an idea, sort of learning through ideas, various ideas that are there, then I think the application for today's times is far more relevant at a practical level.
Yeah, two things on that. I think Kautilya would love cryptocurrencies and blockchains because if he's all about transparency. Second, you mentioned in the Dharmic capitalism chapter how typically you have two approaches where one is I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right, laissez-faire. I hope if that's the right pronunciation, which basically means minimum governmental intervention when private individuals are doing transactions. That's number one. The other is the Keynesian interventionist approach, right? And you said that Dharmic capitalism, this concept where you engage in all the tenets of capitalism, but you have dharma at the center of it, that actually falls right in between these two extremes, right? A couple of things emerge from there. Number one, you live in the US, right? And it seems to the rest of the world that the US is the bedrock of capitalism. The US is also known for consumerism, among other things. And it's the sort of place where capitalism as both being crystallized, but then also gets a bad rep, right? As being inherently exploitative and whatnot. We can get into that, right? And I'm just wondering, this idea of dharma, because I also read through a bunch of things, there's an elaborate definition where it involves no corruption in state officials and governments and administrations, cleanliness, ethics, all of that. We've kind of learned that. We've grown up talking about how, you know, state body should be non-corrupt and focus on the welfare of its people. But the realities are starkly different all across the world. There is not one government to blame. It's everywhere. While Dharmic capitalism sure sounds pleasing to the ears, it, for me, just based on my first reading, it sounded like it's a utopic vision. Do you actually think that dharma at the center of your transactions or the way you conduct business in the world, is that actually possible?
Yeah. So that's a loaded question. So let me sort of split that into a couple of parts.
Sure.
Just to sort of, you know, get to understand what I think Kautilya's, you know, view was, right? See, I don't think, you know, Kautilya doesn't, in my view, doesn't sort of oppose the capitalistic, you know, principles. You know, it's just that the term capitalism is sort of a newer term, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at some of the values that he stood for, right, which is he was open to, you know, trade, had very extensive trade routes, a lot of metals, minerals, and products, you know.
He was a globalist,
went across continents. Yeah. You know, right from textiles to, you know, jewels and jewelries. You had, if you read the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, for example.
Sorry, what was that?
The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but it's a book, you know, which talks about a voyager who sort of goes through various countries and mentions some of these things anecdotally based on his observations. So he comes to India as well. So a lot of these ancient accounts tell you that, you know, these ideas of capitalism that we refer to today, right? A lot of them existed then, right? So Kautilya, in my view, would agree with the broad principles of capitalism as we see it today, right? The question really is, what do we do about the shortcomings of capitalism as we see it today, right? And what some of those earlier ideas could be, you know, and how those ideas could be sort of implemented in today's times. When I mean at a conceptual level, when you talk about dharma, I think what we're trying to say is that, you know, a self-correcting mechanism is that if the state has certain issues, right? Corruption, lack of leadership, and all these type of issues. The dharmic sense that one has, an individual has, when it sort of aggregates, and when the state sort of works on those principles, then there is a sort of a correcting mechanism, right? So this is basically a sort of a tool, an attempt, sort of, at least in Kautilyan times, it was an attempt that was made by him to sort of not have this binary between the state and the market, because he felt this was self-correcting mechanism. But again, in today's times, you're right. I mean, in our private lives, you know, our cultural sort of upbringing, we use dharmic values a lot, at least at a practical level. But still, there are so many challenges. But I think at what can be done, or the principles of dharma could be used at a micro level on certain policies. So, for example, let's take Swachh Bharat, right? A cleanliness drive, right? So if you want a sort of a cleanliness campaign to be really successful, an individual, that is me and you, needs to have a sort of a consciousness of cleanliness within ourselves.
Right. We need to have a moral barometer and then like a yes, a wrong or right of what constitutes cleanliness to even like do that.
Correct. So to motivate an individual to go beyond the prisms of his or her household and keep the society or more cleaner, you have to sort of, the idea of dharma being a self-correcting mechanism is to sort of create the dharmic consciousness within those individuals to sort of go look at the society and then contribute and keep the society clean, right? It's definitely a conceptual sort of idea. It's, in terms of practical implementation, it's very difficult to sort of quantify at the moment. But a lot of our private lives are driven by these concepts. And I think how that aggregates into a sort of a, into a bigger concept is a challenge by itself. But I think Kautilya was quite clear that this is how he would view it. He would use dharma as sort of a foundation. He would refine the foundation more and more, and then build the base on that. I think how that would work in today's times is a work in progress. But I would, think that, again, if you look at particular ideas, particular schemes, and look at ways to sort of trigger those dharmic responsibilities or dharmic sort of, definitions of dharma, which I sort of define in the book, then I think the successes of those schemes could be something that, that could benefit people.
Yeah.
You could call them dharmic nudges, for example, which sort of nudges people. Sorry?
You mean the collective schemes that require you, at least encourage you to say, if you see trash on the street, it is your duty, or you must have some kind of national pride, or it is your responsibility to pick that up, and that's causing you to go out of your way and do something that may have been, do something out of your way that may have been, the trash might have been thrown by someone else. You're not really obliged, but because the way these schemes are designed, it's forcing you to, almost encouraging you to think about, beyond yourself and beyond your immediate family, right?
If you take an issue like, say, climate change, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to make.
You're in the US. I'm sure, like, it's split. Some people don't even think it's real.
Yeah, let's not go there. But yeah, let's assume
let's assume climate change is real. Yeah, I'm just kidding, by the way. I'm just saying that's how split the US is on that. Yeah.
Let's assume we're sensible and, and that would make us think it's real. So, what I'm trying to say is that, if we're going to make a substantive, change in, say, the climate and addressing the issue of climate in this world, it primarily has to be a behavioral solution, right? It has to be an individual, you or me, making a conscious effort to sort of go about our activities which are favorable towards the environment, right? That instinctive choice that you're making, right, in sort of an Indian society, in my view, is that at least part of it is culturally driven, right? What is the percentage might vary depending on people, right? Some people might be more than 50%, 60%. Some people might be 20%, but there is some percentage of your cultural influence defining your sort of consciousness to make a decision to be, say, to protect, the idea of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam in say, a global world, sort of in protecting a global world. And let me put it that way, right?
Right.
So unless that sort of consciousness is sort of triggered for you to sort of make that effort, no matter what regulation law that you bring, unless you as an individual is convinced that this has a bigger purpose, I think the success rate would be still it will be much more if you're consciously driven towards that goal.
Got it.
So I think that's where the idea of dharma could serve as a catalyst, right? And I think that is what Kautilya would also sort of endeavor to. So I think at that level, the idea of enhancing dharma and the buckets of dharma. Again, see, dharma is a very loaded word because there's so many definitions, thousands of pages written on the idea of dharma and whatever it constitutes. I very narrowly defined it into sort of 2 or 3 prisms in the book. Others could define it in other ways as well. But purely for the material sort of world and for statecraft, I sort of brought it into these buckets. So the question really is, how do you sort of have these nudges to make ideas resonate with people more effectively? And how does that sort of help in the bigger picture? I think for today's practical world's purposes, I think that is what would be helpful. But from Kautilya's angle, I think he sort of saw it as foundation to his idea of a state, where I think he would probably go a bit further and sort of try to instill these principles at a much larger scale, given its time and context.
Right. One of the things that economists, and again, I'm speaking of this as a complete layman, one of the things that economists do is make economic predictions and speculate economically. That's the easiest sentence I can conjure up to define what I'm pretty sure is a very complex job. I'm just wondering, are there speculative or prediction-centric things in the Arthshastra that you came across that Kautilya sort of decided to take a chance on? And is there any speculative aspects in the Arthshastra, or is it simply like this political strategist day-to-day manual of how states are run?
Yeah, it's what you're referring to is forecasting, right? So
yes, that. Thank you.
So we have models. You work on, econometric models. You predict. You put in a set of factors together in these models. Give them various factors, and then you come to a conclusion, right? In very, very simplistic layman's terms. And then you modify these models depending on externalities, which is basically external events that are happening, say war in Ukraine or whatever it is. And then you adjust your models to give you quantitative figures, right? Mm-hmm. And how that sort of determines policy and people. That's broadly what, the prism they're talking. In the Arthshastra, there is no sort of, in my understanding, there is no sort of forecasting of, foretelling of anything. The guy, I think he really disliked for, fortune tellers. So I'm not saying economists are fortune tellers, but I'm just saying he felt the need for the text is very, very stoic text. Yeah. There's no sort of fancy things for you to sort of, think about and explore.
What I meant specifically was, say he finds that if we overtax farmers, we see that they protest, right? So can we set something in policy that will prevent future protests? Can we forecast something like that?
Okay. So that's political understanding. That is, so in the sense, okay, I get what you're saying. So whether he saw a threshold for some of these activities which would go out of hand,
right?
Whether he had a sort of intuitive sense of it,
or like even framing economic policy and then assuming that if we have, like, say, 2 tons of grain this year? Could we estimate how much we would get and in 2-3 years? And then based on that, he forms like some of the, he, alters and maneuvers the economics of the state to make sure he reaches that goal.
Yeah, in fact, in a discussion, he even talks about financing. I haven't done much of it in the book, but I've read somewhere that, in some of the Buddhist texts, they talk about how Kautilya had sort of done some deficit financing, which is basically sort of estimating for the next 2-3 years how much of money supply or coin supply that was required in the Mauryan state. And then he adjusted in terms of the need for printing new coins and things like that. So I think he definitely had a sense of that. He had a sense of what the threshold of people's tolerance was. Okay. I think, again, we need to sort of bucket this into 2 areas. One is the political / socio-political elements and the threshold of those elements and Kautilya's understanding of that, right? Taxation is an example. If you're going to increase, say, from his 16 to 18%, if you increase taxes to, say, 40%, he might have a threshold of, say, 20-25%, beyond which people will get annoyed and there'll be revolts and things like that. He definitely had that sense, right, for a lot of his ideas. So that I sort of give it to him. So that's one bucket. Another bucket is sort of, his ability to sort of forecast how much, say, the state would need in, say, 5 years time, right, or 10 years time, right? All the models that we're having today, right? Obviously, there were no models at that time, at least to my knowledge. There's no deep quantitative or complex quantitative theories at that time, at least using computers and data systems that we have today. But there was definitely an understanding of what the requirement is. It might be a simplified sort of, understanding, but he definitely had a sense of, say, how much tons of, when I mean his entire structure.
Right. All his aides, everyone else helping him out.
For example, there are various names that he gives for various people. The trade commissioner, for example, right? There used to be another sort of person so these entities had the ability to sort of forecast and have an estimate of how much they'd be required and all, in, say, 2-3 years time and things like that. So definitely they had some of these sort of insights on how much they had to sort of move around their economic potential, economic capacity to sort of support the growth that was required.
Right.
But whether there was a conceptual, in-depth modeling arithmetic to it, there isn't evidence for that. I think it's safe to say that there's a simplified version of this. It might be logical, not too calculative in nature, but there's definitely an awareness of the limitations of some of these policies.
Right.
And also an awareness of what is required, some level of planning, might be broad planning of what is required in terms of capacity for various parts of the economy.
Yeah, I think based on whatever I read from the book and this discussion, he certainly understood that state treasuries could run dry and resources are scarce, which is one of the bedrocks of economics, right? So you have to operate with that assumption. And I'm just wondering from there, is it possible? This might be out of the purview of the book itself, but do you think he used some kind of would he do arithmetic on a tablet of some kind? Would he get people to verbally count the number of grains or the number of resources the state had? Because one of the things you also mentioned is just how wide the entire empire is, right? To actually get proper numbers on all the stocks and resources and assets the state has is a momentous task. It's quite difficult, right? Are there mentions of that or on how he essentially administrated all of that?
Yeah, in fact, there was also sort of a modern day equivalent of an ancient equivalent of a statistics office in some of
Really?
these departments. Yeah, in the sense which sort of where the role of the person is just to go and get the numbers, estimates of various, say, grains, or since you gave those examples, various components of the economy. Then, so there are definitely people who are assigned to do some of these things, though it might be manual, though the estimates might be more sort of not too specific.
Right.
But
Approximations, a lot of
approximations. Yeah. But see, look, one advantage that these guys had was that it was a highly decentralized system, right?
Really? I mean, you
In
would
the
assume
sense
that you would assume that everything just lies in the seat of power where the capitalist city is.
No, but when I mean decentralized, what I'm trying to say is that every village, for example, had a sort of a gram panchayat in modern day sort of parlance, and a sort of a governance which is decentralized towards those villages or a group of villages, right? So that sort of aggregated to the bigger picture. I mean, there was a sort of a central sort of entity which controlled and had some certain basic policies, but a lot of the governance was decentralized, and that's even seen even in common era, right? I mean, if you look at our huge temples that we have, most of the temples were used as financial institutions, storage of gold, storage of all sorts of wealth. In fact, I come from Tamil Nadu. If you look at the Chola empires, and the dominance that they had, across Southeast Asia, especially in early CE, the thousands of temples that they built in Tamil Nadu, for example, a lot of them had huge sort of reserves of gold. You take the Padmanabha Swami temple in Kerala, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
The vaults of gold runs into billions of dollars. So in those days, billions or even trillions, those days, temples were sort of central to the village apparatus, where not only did it serve as a religious purpose, it served as a cultural sort of center point. It also served as a financial center point, because it served as a storage point for guilds and banks. It served as a sort of a financial institution for transactions.
So it was not just a mere place of worship. It was basically like the heart of a lot of economics, a lot of administration, and a lot of
Yeah, because that's why you would see that, especially when you go to Tamil Nadu villages in Tamil Nadu, for example, every village or a major town or center would have a huge temple, which is the center of it. Because it still serves as a central sort of buzz of activity, besides its religious purpose, to run, the economics around the village. And one of the reasons why it's decentralized is because of this system, right? So even during Kautilyan times, you had a sort of at an operational level, a lot of decentralization at these levels, right? So I think, sort of answering a question, I think the ability to sort of decentralize and then have effective solutions or solutions at a more granular level makes Kautilya's sort of idea far more effective, I feel.
Sriram, I'm telling you, he would love cryptocurrencies. He's all about that. The parallels are just astounding. Cool. So,
and it also adds spice to all your secretive sort of zeal that he has.
Yeah, because I mean, there's decentralization, there's open, like transparent transactions and contracts and whatnot. It's all there. Pretty sure someone will figure out how to make an NFT for Kautilya if at all he gets that famous. Um, but hey, it's been great hosting you in Dostcast. Thank you for explaining all the nitty gritties of this man who will hopefully um, resurge once again in our consciousness in India, and whoever watches content online, they can certainly check out the Arthashastra themselves. One of the things you mentioned at the start of the book is you had a one-page summary of the Arthashastra to sort of, that was one of the, you were holding another the one-page summary of the Arthashastra, and you also had Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in front of you. I actually want to ask you selfishly, going out of the way of Dharmic capitalism, two recommendations. Number one, I do have Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's a fat book. It's highly inaccessible. I dare not think of reading it. Do you know if there are shorter passages, like maybe that could save my time and give me the outline? So I can then delve into each of them, because that is a huge treatise. It's like, you don't want to read Charles Darwin's Origin of Species because it's just so, like, it's anachronistic. It's not from this time. Number one. Second, I found that the Stanford Encyclopedia does have a very interesting passage on the Arthashastra. And I was just wondering if you could just help me with those two recommendations on how to kind of get abridged versions of each of those.
Okay. On the first one, I have to probably get back to you on that.
No worries.
Because I did read the fat book as well, though it's sort of smaller but fat. But anyways, but yeah, I mean, that I probably have to get back to you. But on the Arthashastra, I think, the funny thing is, though many people talk about the Arthashastra quite a lot, I mean, as if they have, they're born in this Janma only to do this. But the fact is, there are only three to four big translations of the text, right? Which is one by Shyama Sastry in 1415, one by Kangle in 1960, three volumes of Kangle, then Rangarajan in early 1990s, and then a few other T.G. Sastry again in early 19th century. But 4 to 5 really authentic sort of translations, right?
And are they dense to get through?
Sorry?
Are they dense books still? Are they dense to get through?
fairly dense, I would say. But what I'm trying to say is that for a subject that's been debated, discussed among common people so extensively, having just 4 to 5 big translations is a fallacy by itself, right? And having a lot of these translations, which is done, say, 100 years ago, itself is something that we need to sort. That was one of the triggers for this entire book. I mean, because, right in that first scene, which you sort of mentioned in the book, is that I realized that the artha part of it, of the text, was fairly limited. In fact, there was just one book by Professor Sehag, which I mentioned, which talks about the economics of Kautilya, while everything else was either on the strategic element or the political element. Another component is on, say, the business element, or another component is on fiction, for example.
Fiction.
Yeah, for example, Ashwin has written on the Chanakya's chant.
Right.
Inspired fiction, I mean, based on. I could literally find just one book at that time, which was a core sort of an economic book. So I was just completely bemused or extremely amazed that, that's the state of affairs. So that probably was one of my drivers to sort of get into this. And just to conclude my urge to your readers who end up reading the book is to, one of my basic purposes of doing this exercise, despite spending a lot of time on it, is to create an awareness among your readers, listeners, on what Kautilya was thinking or what he could have thought.
Mm-hmm.
And to create an awareness that there was a guy thousands of years ago who had an ability to grasp a lot, many of these things, and had a sort of a grasp of these things, grasp and sort of vision of a bigger picture, and then a grasp of the practical elements of these things. And to create that awareness among the readers so that people understand this. And then debate, discuss, have, 10, 15, 20 books on the subject, which it deserves for all the talk that people talk about it.
Yeah.
So that is sort of,
the
since
number
you
of
got onto
times, the number of times the word Chanakya Niti is mentioned to me alone in a week is astounding, which is weird because this guy has been dead for years, right? It's just that it's one of those things where the word becomes more popular than the content behind it, right? It's one of the many things. Like everyone will mention the Gita, and so few have read it, right? Everyone will mention Mahabharata, so few have read it. It's just one of those things where we don't necessarily know the origin story, but we're very eager to use it in common parlance. So it's lost. Yeah.
One point there, right?
Yeah.
Though very few have read the Gita and the Mahabharata, there are many people who have done translations of it.
Correct.
There are many interpretations of Mahabharata and the Gita, right? And many people have read it diligently and use it in their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Kautilya, the translators are very, very small in number, right? Yeah. But many people use it extensively for whatever those purposes that they are.
Well, it's the same thing with the Wealth of Nations, no, right? I'm sure people engage in capitalism, but I don't know how many people are actually like writing commentaries on Adam Smith.
Yeah, that's true. I would love your, readers to read the book and share feedback and what they think about it.
Where can they find it?
We can share a link.
Where can they find it? Is it available on, when we release this, will it be available on Amazon?
That's right. It's available on Amazon. When we release it, it'll be definitely available. So this weekend, it's going to the bookstores.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, one of the wonderful things that I hope also to have, just like you, is to have a book with my name on it. Like there's just something you can be a digital millionaire and have digital things all your life, but there's something about a tangible, proof of work. I know it's taken you 5 years, so more power to you. And thank you so much for being on Dostcast. Where can people find you if they want to follow your work, if they want to engage with you? Do you have public profiles of some kind?
Yeah, I'm not too active on social media. I sort of wanted to be a bit more sane, so I sort of
wanted to be a little more secretive, like Kautilya.
Yeah, not secretive, just to have some, not to be overwhelmed with too many messages and worrying about everything in the world. But anyway, so I have my website, srirambala.in, SRIRAMBALA.in.
Mm-hmm.
There's a contact page. If there's anything that you guys want to reach out, talk about, we'd be glad to address them. So that I think
also
would
have a
be
Twitter,
good.
right? You also have a Twitter.
No, I'm not on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, but not on Twitter. Twitter is just too toxic for me at the moment. But yeah.
There's a small part of Twitter that's very fun though. It's this value Twitter. I think like the whole Indic Twitter is semi-value, semi-filled with people fighting. But yeah, there's values. Like if you write threads, if you write like mini threads or excerpts from this on Twitter, they would work really well. But that's
I agree. But the thing is, whether you like it or not, Vinamre, is that I don't have an opinion on every single issue.
That's true.
So
you don't have to. You can just retweet. You can just post screenshots of your book and just retweet. When people.
No, but I'm told nowadays by younger people, not that I'm too old, but is that TikTok and sort of those mediums are far more, the in thing.
Or you're not. I'm guarantee you, no one on TikTok is going to read your book. That's just it's a different ball game altogether. It's. Do you like it's? Are you going to have a Kindle book out? Are you going to have an audio book out?
There's a Kindle version coming out.
Yeah. An audiobook is going to be harder though, right? Because there's so many graphs and
correct
other things.
Yeah, that's right. But we're looking at multiple languages. That's probably the next step, I think, because, especially I think this sort of a book would have a decent reach in say, regional languages.
100%.
So, yeah, that's probably the next.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Sriram. Best of luck to you. Make sure if you guys are interested in the conversation, if you're interested in economics, if you're interested in Chanakya and want to know more than the fact that he was a guy with a ponytail, you can check out Kautliyanomics for modern times and purchase it. All right. Sweet.